Chapter 8 El Panal Commune, Seething with Popular Power. The barrios of Venezuela's largest cities have long fascinated visitors from around the world. Caracas, the capital, has working-class barrios consisting of huge tracts of improvised construction that cover the hillsides in a seemingly endless labyrinth of houses and stairways. The houses are built from simple materials. Cement or clay blocks are the most common, along with scavenged tie bar and steel beams, but as self-built structures, they show what appears to be unlimited creativity and innovation. The result is a harlequin landscape made up of Escher-like constructions that twist and creep around the irregular terrain and are sometimes even cantilevered over the slopes. The irregularity of the buildings and the immense scale of the patchwork conglomerate they compose make an impression of sublimity on almost all who see these hillside barrios. Surveying a barrio from the window of a high-rise hotel or modern highway, visitors from other countries and social classes encounter an urban landscape that surprises them, offering a slightly overwhelming but also pleasant frisson. What European romantics experienced some 200 years ago, before snowy mountain peaks or huge cascades of water, that quickening of the heart and emptiness in the gut, is relived when overlooking these humanly made, awe-inspiring panoramas. These barrios grew up with the depopulation of Venezuela's rural areas during the second half of the 20th century. Rural to urban migration was a process that affected all Latin American countries in different degrees and with varied time frames. However, in Venezuela, the migration process was particularly rapid due to the impact of the oil industry. Oil profits in a country that for 40 years was the world's main oil exporter and continues to have the world's largest proven reserves, made all other economic activities pale by comparison to what the black gold could generate. This imbalance in the economy is sometimes called the Dutch disease, in reference to how natural gas exploitation impacted the Netherlands. But the problem is structural, and more endemic to Venezuela than any other country. The widespread practice of importing food with petrodollars strangled much of the country's agriculture during the 20th century, which survived mostly in a few specialized sectors, along with low-intensity subsistence plots called conucos. From the rural wastelands, large masses of people began to flow to the cities, looking for education, health services, and work. Their expectations often met with disappointment. Sometimes, and these were the best jobs, they found employment in construction. But more often they had to turn to micro-commerce, odd jobs, or petty crime. If lucky, a young family member might obtain low-level employment in public administration, which could provide a constant, if limited, income to be shared in the family. Most of the poor barrios of Caracas were built by a process popularly known as invasión. People coming from the rural areas would occupy a tract of unused land, usually on a hillside. They would enter by night and prepare themselves to resist the combined repression from the forces of order and private owners in the upcoming days. They first built improvised and fragile houses with techos de cartón, cardboard roofs, in the phrase made famous by Venezuela's revolutionary songwriter Ali Primera. With time, they reinforced these initial structures with brick and steel. The new residents would later divert electricity from the municipal system and begin to develop crude plumbing. Like all migrants, these people came not as mere biological beings, but as multidimensional bearers of their culture and life practices. What is remarkable, however, among Venezuela's rural to urban migrants is how so many aspects of their traditional rural lifestyle formed over the long duration proved to be more resilient than those of their sisters and brothers in 19th century European cities. For example, rural habits such as early waking and early bedtimes persisted in these barrios, and the same could be said for rural values such as solidarity, reciprocity, and a suspicion of those who enriched themselves. Vil Hadeus. The history of Venezuelan politics is spotted with governmental efforts to eliminate the poor hillside barrios, or what the newspapers came to call Rings of urban misery. The 23 de Enero barrio in the west of Caracas, famous today for its revolutionary activity, is the surprising result of one of these reform efforts. Beginning in the 1950s, it became the site of a massive construction project, consisting of some 30 large residential blocks that together could house almost 100,000 people. The project was initially conceived by dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez with the aim of providing residence for soldiers and people close to the government, while displacing poor people out of the zone. The idea of the nerdy dictator, Pérez Jiménez was legendary for his high grades in the military academy, was to build a ville radieuse on the Le Corbusier model, a radiant city with open sightlines and clear spaces between tall residential blocks. He imagined obedient soldiers and their families living quietly under the despotically imposed order and progress of a regime that so far had successfully contained class struggle. However, history had something else in store. The project conceived by the dictator would soon be occupied by desperate masses from around the area who invaded the buildings and then had them renamed from December 2, the day the dictator's rule began, for the very day that a popular uprising took him down, January 23, 1958. Nevertheless, things were not easy in the new epoch that began after the fall of the dictator, since the elected governments that came next were not much better. Under the restricted, even farcical democracy of Venezuela's Fourth Republic, 1958 to 1998, everything proved to be a struggle for the new inhabitants of the 23 de Enero housing blocks, and the poor of Caracas more generally. They had occupied the modern buildings, but had to clamor to obtain water, electricity, and basic services. The constant protests they carried out and the rural sociality they brought with them meant that these neighborhoods never became spaces of social isolation and estrangement. In this sense, they differed markedly from the panoptic urban spaces in the global north that, in terms of infrastructure, they superficially resembled. Nor do they repeat the logic of the residential zones of the early industrial cities in Europe, such as the poor sections of Manchester, where Friedrich Engels felt that people had been forced to sacrifice the best qualities of their human nature, and there was a unfeeling isolation of each in his private interest. Latin American urbanism in the 20th century, even in modernized zones designed for social control, was markedly different from such European precedents, for here every space of the neighborhood was overflowing with irrepressible social life. The life of the barrio included commerce, culture, and musical groups, community radios, but also, given 23 de Enero's history, revolutionary political organization. If this barrio had played a key role in taking down the dictator and in fighting to secure services for its residents after his fall, its work in favor of social justice did not stop there. The struggles of its residents expanded into the upcoming decade and took on organic form. The strength of these communities was such that the occupied buildings became the site of numerous popular power initiatives, while many of the barrio's grassroots organizations, usually referred to with the umbrella term collectives, in the mainstream discourse, took on a more overtly political and sometimes explicitly communist character. Many of these collectives struggled against the closely paired combo of police repression and the drug trade. The first of the socially conscious local organizations to emerge that had a clear Marxist and internationalist calling was the Coordinadora Simón Bolívar, which was important in the struggles of the 1990s and in the early years of the Bolivarian process. However, it was an excision from the Coordinadora led by the creative and charismatic Robert Lonja that would prove to have greater staying power. Lonja's organization, called Alexis Vive, would give rise to the El Panal Commune in 2006, which is far and above the most successful and fascinating of Venezuela's urban communes. Parallel lives. Robert Lonja was a rebellious kid, even thrown out of the house, and later put in jail for his rebelliousness. The whole social context at that time of fake pro-imperialist democracy was so rife with injustices that it blurred the boundaries between crime, rebellion, and revolution. That was because whether you followed the rules or not, you could count on the police coming for you. The system crushed people indifferently, not bothering to investigate first whether they were law-abiding or not. It was an extreme situation that made rebellion a duty and defiance a point of honor. For example, when a group of barrio kids like Lonja raided an ice cream truck and shared its contents among friends and comrades, it was an action that crossed over between the categories of law-breaking, self-empowerment, and reparations. Probably no writer has grasped this as fully as Victor Hugo. For the great author of Les Miserables, injustice was above all something felt, and sentiment was at the center of his vision of human society, both the bad and the good in it. So too for Robert Lonja, who says today that the revolutionary organization he founded and named in honor of his dead mentor, Alexis Gonzalez, is above all a sentiment. That sentiment extends to the organization's clothing. Born among concrete towers that block out the sunlight, Alexis Vive militants always wear baby blue shirts that Lonja told me stand for open skies, dreams, and hope. Tossed out onto the street when he was just 14 years old, Lonja lived in a machine room above an elevator shaft in one of the huge apartment blocks of 23 de Enero. He conspired in this tiny space with his friends, reading as much as he could lay his hands on. Lonja always had Che Guevara nearby, both on the wall in a photo and close to his heart as an ideal. He loved Che. Then, when Hugo Chavez came onto the scene, he fell for him too. Now in his mid-40s, Lonja says he would rather die than betray the now-deceased revolutionary leader. In fact, Lonja's and Chavez's lives were lived out with a strange synchronicity, strange parallels. Lonja was sent to Jare prison near Caracas, where Chavez had ended up in his 1992 uprising. Then, in 1999, Lonja's release from Jare coincided with Chavez's election to the presidency. These kindred spirits were not only in tune, but both were on the rise. Each began a process of building. For Lonja, this meant building an organization in the barrio where he was born, first making the revolutionary Colectivo Alexis Vive in 2001, then 5 years later, El Panal Commune. As its first project, the Alexis Vive Collective initially took on running drug traffickers out of the zone, eliminating a scourge that the powers that be and police had collaborated to introduce in the barrio in the 1980s and 90s to quell its revolutionary spirit. Alexis Vive needed to wipe the slate clean, but that was just the first step in a long, ongoing process of community construction. The commune's headquarters. The headquarters of the Alexis Vive Collective is a narrow 3-story building huddled next to a roofed basketball court, all of it in the shadow of a large tower block. You can get to it by taking a turn off the main road that leads into 23 de Enero from the subway station, then passing under an archway that reads, Bienvenidos, Comuna Socialista El Panal, 2021. The path takes you by a strip mall, then between narrow apartment blocks, and an empty lot with a hexagonal Cuban barrio adentro module squatting in one corner. A strange silence and uncommon orderliness reigns in the zone, very different from most Caracas barrios. There is a reason for this. A keen observer might register that along with a scattering of honeycomb graffitis that have been painted along the way, discreetly placed CCTV cameras are at key points along the path. This is how the 40 or so cadres of Alexis Vive monitor the zone from their headquarters and ensure that drug trafficking organizations, and most likely even the police, do not enter the hard-won territory they have controlled for some 20 years. The Alexis Vive headquarters is an office space located on the second floor of this building, which also houses the organization's arsenal radio station, and just underneath, its deep litter pig pen. The office comprises the 300 square feet where Robert Lonja now leads most of his life. Security issues have dictated this lifestyle for him, since chasing out powerful narcos and their police allies from the barrio has left behind a trail of potentially lethal vendettas. The most notable things in the office, apart from Lonja's imposing presence, are a lapdog named Plekhanov and a large portrait of Che, which is on a wall opposite the monitor that draws the feed from the CCTV cameras. With a beefy 6-foot frame, Lonja is big for a Venezuelan who grew up in the poor barrios. His friends called him El Ruso, the Russian, when they do not call him El Comandante. If you ask Lonja what inspired his group to get a head start in building a commune, beginning to do so even before Chavez made the communes an official state project around 2009, he will say that they built their flagship commune as simply an extension of the model that Chavez defined as participative and protagonistic democracy. Apart from that, they were inspired by the Paris Commune, adapting its model of self-government to their own space, time, and reality. At least this is how Lonja sees things, who views his historic role as that of putting Marxism-Leninism at the service of the popular power. The first concrete and visible step toward building the El Panal Commune occurred in 2006 when a private construction firm was working in the barrio. The Alexis Vive collective leaned on them to build the arch for the commune at the entrance, the one with the inscription saying, "Welcome to El Panal Commune 2021. In effect, they made the construction firm carry out a social project based on the 2% of their budget that Venezuelan law mandates all state-contracted firms should direct to community projects. This gesture, of applying at least the threat of force to make sure the law was carried out, was in some ways a repetition of what Alexis Vive had done to get corrupt police and drug traffickers out of the neighborhood because they had set the barrio back so much in terms of popular power and revolutionary organization in the 1980s and 90s. Then, too, they had worked mostly with persuasion, as when they had projected movies in public spaces formerly used for the narcotics trade, while helping the dealers find other jobs. However, as everyone knew, the Alexis Vive collective had the organizational strength and even the firepower to back up its proposals. Yet the communal arch was only an outward sign of a deeper organizational process underway. That process eventually brought together the 8 communal councils in the zone into the new El Panal Commune, guaranteeing its economic viability by linking the incipient commune to a socially owned bakery that offered large volumes of rigorously price-controlled bread to folks in the neighborhood, along with a now-defunct sugar-packing business that is soon to become an animal feed plant. Lonja may have masterminded this project, but he believes that the community should take the initiative of involving itself in the commune, with the organizational vanguard, Alexis Vive, working mostly to encourage people to commit themselves, convincing them to take charge of their lives and their community. The robust commune that exists today speaks for the correctness of Lonja's wager. El Panal is the most consolidated and ambitious urban commune in Venezuela. Even if the beginnings of the project were humble, with much of the work of winning over hearts and minds for the project being done with volunteer activities that he and his closest comrades did, like cleaning stairways of the apartment blocks, which were always sore points in the community. Throughout, the process of constructing the commune has been maintained by Lonja's total faith in Chavez's strategy of socialist construction. Asked if it's possible to build socialism through the commune, Lonja brightens up and smiles. Not only is it possible, but we are convinced that it is the correct line. It is the most efficient and effective way to build the model that Chavez defined. Anacaona. The commune they have built is called El Panal, the beehive, because bees do hard, collective work. Indeed, a deeply ingrained work ethic is evident in this commune where the militants, likely as deliberate affront to mainstream values, usually sport stained clothing and dirty shoes, and they never stop moving about and multitasking. This is the case with Barbara Anacaona Martinez, who is Lonja's second in command in the Alexis Vive collective and the main organizer of the El Panal Commune. In her tattered baby blue shirt and worn-out sneakers, Martinez is rarely inactive for even a moment. She seems to be constantly greeting people from the barrio who pass by while never ceasing to send text messages right and left about pressing business. Sira and I have just managed to corral this high-level Alexis Vive cadre for an interview in the bleachers of the basketball court. Yet as we begin chatting, a pair of bank employees from the city center show up on the other side of the court to inspect the commune for a possible loan. They appear somewhat lost. Martinez shouts curt orders to them, telling the disoriented bankers where they can wait and find chairs. I can't help thinking that it is gratifying to be in a place where, contrary to the norm, it's the bankers who are made to wait for people. Despite the interruption, Martinez has not lost the thread of her narrative, which weaves together complex ideas about socialist theory, the 23 de Enero barrio's history, and principles of communal organization into a seamless whole. Martinez's past is relevant because she is not strictly speaking from the grassroots. She met Lonja in the sociology department of the Universidad Central de Venezuela, where they were both studying, and because of her talent and commitment, she was soon brought into the organization's leadership. As part of our investigation, we are interested in what this cadre can tell us about the relation between the vanguard organization, Alexis Vive, and the more inclusive project of building the El Panal Commune as an expression of popular power. To explain why this vanguard has succeeded where others have failed, Martinez emphasizes that as militants of Alexis Vive, they are not extraterrestrials, but part of the community itself. She herself now lives in the Camboya neighborhood that is inside the commune. Their only distinction is that they belong to a social and political organization that understands its role in the community. Moreover, Alexis Vive's aim is not to appropriate people's participation, but rather to blend with the people. Much of this, she tells us, has to do with managing contradictions inside the community and simply accompanying them in processes of self-organization. The Alexis Vive Collective is a more or less vertical organization of cadres, not unlike a Leninist party. It has a strict sequence of command, with Martinez on the first tier, in what is called the Comandancia. Though the command structure is directional, it is founded more on conscious discipline and moral example than blind obedience. Commands are conveyed through walkie-talkies that connect the main militants. The military nature of the organization and the power that afforded them allowed the collective to successfully free the barrio from drug mafias and police oppression, and jumpstart communal construction by a few years, well before Chavez started the nationwide drive. All of this was done in urban conditions that have proved to be overwhelming obstacles for other leftist groups in the country. Yet organizers like Martinez are completely aware that they cannot subordinate either the commune or community councils in the zone to their more tight-knit organization, Alexis Vive. To do so would be to nip popular power in the bud. This is where hard work, leading by example, and showing restraint comes in. The cadres of the organization do a great deal of manual work themselves, taking on the hardest, dirtiest jobs. They want to be the first to arrive to do any chore and the last to leave. Also, while there is always much to be done, nothing should be approached as a mere task. Rather, the trick, Martinez tells us, is to find the revolutionary side and strategic implications of every activity that appears along the way. Leadership examples. This organizational approach turns as much on prudent leadership as it is an interpretive task. Two incidents that I witnessed speak for the Alexis Vive Collective's careful and creative modus operandi with the community. One involved a young Alexis Vive cadre who was giving a tour to a group of community representatives through the commune's different productive units. The tour was carefully done, and the dozens or so representatives were led from the bakery and textile factory to the fish farm and pigsty, with the young cadre explaining at each stop how things work in a technical sense. There were photos and laughter, and everybody was enjoying themselves a great deal. To me, it seemed to be a wonderful tour and all very well executed. Hence, I was surprised to find that Martinez had taken aside the young cadre and was criticizing him for making it into a mere museum tour. She insisted that there should be a process of formation and theoretical learning associated with each such experience, especially a visit from interested community members. The strategic aim of the commune and the relation of its productive projects to the socialist goal had been ignored. The young cadre had fallen into economism. As a corrective, Martinez suggested that everybody in the group learn something about productive forces and their connection to relations of production, and she pointed them to the relevant sections of Martha Harnecker's work, The Basic Concepts for Historical Materialism. The second incident happened during the elections of Communal Council spokespeople. The elections occurred over the weekend, and conducting them was a massive operation involving some 10,000 potential voters, reaching to all bases of the El Panal Commune and beyond. The Alexis Vive Collective took charge of setting up polling stations and maintaining security, and even launched its own candidates for many positions. They did all the organizational work masterfully. The atmosphere during the voting process was good-natured and festive, with enthusiastic participation and free soup doled out while people hung out near the polls, talking about barrio life and current events. Turnout was good too, reaching more than 40% of potential voters. However, at the end of the day, Alexis Vive's candidates did not always come out winners, and Robert Lonja himself did not land the post he wanted in his communal council. Yet, I was able to witness how Martinez took charge of the situation and spoke with a great deal of maturity and farsightedness about what the results meant for the commune's future. Her carefully chosen words were only constructive and advisory. In the spirit of counsel, she told the newly elected spokespeople that they were not owners, not representatives, not a network, but spokespeople for the community. They were also advised that being a spokesperson was hard work, and reminded that they could be revoked if they failed to carry out the mandate the community had given them. Working alongside the community rather than outside it, Martinez clearly excels at sorting out contradictions among the people and giving a revolutionary reading to situations as they emerge in the barrio's organizational processes. Through her practice, one can see how important interpretation is to community leadership and revolutionary direction. Arguably, constructing a narrative so that people understand the strategic aim is the better part of community organizing in many circumstances. For this reason, there is a constant effort at El Panal Commune to apply a political spin to any and every activity, and thus drive home the strategic question of what is the commune? And what is the commune for? In Martinez's words, which she makes good on through her coherent leadership style, Alexis Vive does not want to be a vanguard that defines people's lives, but rather works so that people are convinced and take charge of their own lives. They aim to meld with the people at the same time that they promote a logic where economics is consistently subordinated to politics, or one where politics is in command, to use the old Maoist maxim they have internalized. When I think about the work being done here, it seems to me that it is the heroic narrative of epic dimensions, carefully constructed through an ongoing interpretive process that keeps people going in this organization. It also forms the basis of their connection to the wider community. On a temporal axis, that narrative reaches back to the past, as Lonja's comments indicate, and it expresses loyalty to Chavez while projecting his project forward into a socialist future. In a geographic sense, it weaves together the work of the smallest cell in the beehive to the region, the nation, and beyond. Cadres like Martinez work to develop and maintain this epic narrative, carefully subsuming each small step into its strategic architecture as a way of prefiguring the greater goal, which provides a social cement in the community and continuity for the project through time. Sadly, this kind of overarching epic narrative has generally been lacking in Venezuela since Chavez died, where both the government and people are operating most often in survival mode. Of course, El Panal Commune is also in this mode much of the time. However, survival here is always seen as a step towards something greater, toward emancipation, and not only in the small neck of the woods, but for Venezuela as a whole and internationally. The communards here try and make all the elements they develop on a micro or local scale fit into an overarching plan. Communal planning. Planning and communication are things that bees also do, though these features of the communal insect's behavior were unknown until scientists discovered their waggle dance in the mid-20th century. For example, Karl Marx was clearly limited by the science of his time when he contrasted honeybees with human architects, thinking that only the latter could plan something before doing it. Of course, Marx was right about the praxis of the human being, which he wished to characterize as an animal capable of proposing and planning, even if he underestimated bees. In our time, however, the communards at El Panal, who have bees embroidered on their shirts and painted all over the walls of their barrio, are making good on the correct appreciation of the animal that gives their commune its name by engaging in detailed and ambitious planning of their projects. This applies most fully to the economic side of El Panal's work, whose largest planning framework, called the Distrito Económico, economic district, goes hand in hand with sweeping notions of how to reindustrialize a wide zone that reaches outside the strict territory of the commune and into much of the west of Caracas. El Panal's economic district coordinates three main productive projects: fish farming, pig raising, textile production, all of them expressions of socialist property and worker control, along with a handful of jurisdictionally private businesses that provide resources for the commune. At the center of the economic district is a communal bank that has a role in organizing, planning, and developing projects in the zone. Having a communal bank to help with planning and coordination is a basic feature that El Panal Commune shares with most other communes in Venezuela. It is part of the law of communes. The presence of a bank in these communes could seem odd, yet it is not about market socialism, which is the very antithesis of the project of the communal socialism, with its strategic aim of completely overcoming the rule of value production. Quite the opposite, inasmuch as the communal banks coordinate resources for the productive projects that are under a commune's control or are associated with it. They are transitory institutions that aim to keep market relations at bay as long as the communes, still making their first steps, are like socialist islands adrift in a capitalist sea, where monetary relations will, unfortunately, persist during the course of the transition. In El Panal, the communal bank, which at one time issued its own currency, is now focused on managing the range of projects that are included in the Distrito Económico, both the small businesses that are allied with the commune and provide it with resources, and the strictly communal enterprises, EPSs, that operate under the framework of socialist property. According to Alexis Vive Cadre, Asdrúbal Rendón, nicknamed Tijuana, the unique character of this grassroots institution has to do with its coordinating and allotting role. The communal bank at El Panal does not suck the life out of the working class like a traditional financial institution, he told me. Instead, our bank is an arm of the economic district, which is the organ that plans the commune's economy. This is aptly put, and it locates well the task that El Panal's communal bank aims to accomplish, inasmuch as it exists as a defensive and provisional firewall to the market relations that exist outside. During the transition to socialism, when finances and markets still permeate the remainder of society, such internal coordination of its funds may keep El Panal Commune from falling prey to financial systems that are all too willing to either crush or deform community projects and communal enterprises. Abejita's Textile Workshop. On our second day at the commune, we visit one of the communal enterprises that forms part of the Distrito Económico, a tailoring shop called Las Abejitas, Little Bees, of El Panal. The project is tucked into a former shopping mall, a short walk from the building housing Lonja's office. There, in a brightly lit space, are rows of industrial sewing machines alongside a colorful boutique with mannequins that display both the Abejita's line of work clothes and school uniforms, and an array of casual, everyday clothes. All the products sport El Panal Commune's stylized bee logo. This icon consists of a striped teardrop that represents a bee's abdomen and stinger. On crossing the shop's threshold, flanked by images of Bolivar and Chavez, we are greeted by one of the workers, the 50-something Jose Lugo. A former naval officer, Lugo was won over for the revolution when he saw the work of Cuban doctors in his own barrio. He was in turn brought into El Panal project when Robert Lonja got in touch with him around 2012. Now, Lugo is working in this socialist enterprise with great enthusiasm. As someone who has traded arms for a sewing machine, he enjoys joking that imperialism was right about Venezuela when it declared the country to be an extraordinary and unusual threat. Lugo generally points to the bays of sewing machines when saying so. "We are a terrible threat," he says with a chuckle. Not for any military reason, but because of the socialist example that is taking shape in projects like the one you are visiting. Accompanying Lugo in the shop today is Margarita Marquez, a longtime staff member here. She worked from her house as a tailor from the time she was just 15, joining the Abejita's textile project when her children were already adults. Tailoring is widespread in the barrios, so it was a natural transition for Marquez, Lugo, and others to organize the work as a communal business, a social property enterprise. The market for these textile products, the profits from which are managed by the communal bank, are both individual and private and public institutions, such as the contract they once had to make uniforms for a small airport near Caracas, and another more recent commission for shirts from the Ministry of Communes. Marquez takes a pause from her work to tell us how she likes the shop floor environment here, which has helped her develop as a person. A key benefit is that the workers at Abejitas do varied tasks and thereby learn about the entire production process, which helps break down the fragmentation of knowledge and skills that comes with the capitalist division of labor. "I don't like the idea of working for a private business," Marquez says, "since it means spending the whole day seated at one place and doing one task. I feel very comfortable here. It's like my second home." Along with personal development based on learning new skills, remember that Marx in the Grundrisse said that real wealth is the developed productive power of all individuals. Marquez points to how the communal enterprise has given workers like her recognition from the community and even resulted in her appearing on public television. This is one worker's lived experience of communal socialism, socialism seen from the inside, and it has as much to do with affect and dignity as it does with the end of economic exploitation. It is interesting that when you ask Marquez, Lugo, or other workers about what makes this small enterprise socialist, all will put emphasis on details such as the pleasant work environment and the free snacks that we are now munching on with the workers. They will point to how in the Abejitas workshop there are no restrictions on how many times you can go to the bathroom or how often you can use your telephone. And the overall environment is friendly. In their vision of socialist work, qualitative aspects, as opposed to quantitative ones, come to the foreground. The Abejitas workers' internally developed value system, which puts emphasis on a pleasing environment and humanely gratifying activity, is typical of the language used in the Chavista grassroots to refer to socialism and describe the world they want. For example, one hears from most workers that such and such an activity or project isn't capitalist but socialist, while what they identify as socialist features is not so much equal salaries, which do in fact exist here, but rather how the project helps the community, treats people fairly and gently, and provides human comforts. Dogmatists might consider this quaint because, armed with what they believe to be socialist science, they reduce socialism to simply the end of exploitation and relegate the rest to mere decoration and feel-good details. Socialism, in this view, has a hard core, which in their interpretation of social ownership is delivering simply more value, or even the whole of the value produced, to the workers. But they would be wrong, for a conception of socialism that is based only on a fair distribution of economic value is problematic because it falls short of what is needed. It would be far better to conceive socialist emancipation in terms of that center non-alienated labor and internal democracy, along with forms of labor and social life more generally that are not subsumed under the logic of capitalist value relations. For it is precisely through de-alienated, directly social labor, along with substantial democratic control of one's labor activities and products, and it is precisely by cultivating humanely enjoyable and meaningful forms of interaction on a capillary level, both in the workplaces and communities, that the logic of capital, and economic exploitation too, can be completely eradicated from society. So Venezuela's grassroots militants, with their homegrown discourse based on experience more than books, actually have a great deal of socialist science on their side. They are correct to bring pleasure and de-alienation, along with internal democracy, to the forefront of their vision of socialism. This is the essence of Marx's scientific approach to socialism. And in other passages from the Grundrisse and Capital, he refers to wealth as including the universality of the individual's needs, capacities, and enjoyments, while claiming that capitalism is already abolished once we assume that it is enjoyment that is the driving principle, and not enrichment itself. Year Zero. Sometimes the true dimensions of contemporary events can best be perceived with comparisons. Arguably, the sanctions the United States has imposed on Venezuela since 2015 can be compared to putting the entire population of the country, including children, the old, and the sick, in a concentration camp. Under the regime of sanctions, every day brought a new turn of the screw for the population, in a context defined by scarce food, daily deaths, and almost no light at the end of the tunnel. One looked around and saw the clothes falling off people, dazed patients without medication wandering the streets, families making desperate plans to migrate, and one got the distinct feeling that the depths of human cruelty were being probed. What were these ruthless, coercive economic measures for? The experience could leave you feeling paralyzed. What possible motive could make a powerful country want to decimate the population of another? Was it for their sin of being born Venezuelans? Just as in the last century, others were persecuted and murdered for being Jews or Armenians? Thinking about the U.S. blockade could leave you feeling nonplussed, empty, and hopeless. The Alexis Vive Collective understood the danger of this psychological state. Its leader, Robert Lonja, told me that after a prolonged stay in a rural zone during the early years of the blockade, he returned to the barrio and found that people had a distant, glazed look in their eyes. Somehow there had to be a way to get people snapped out of their hypnosis and begin to struggle, even if symbolically. That was when Lonja came up with the idea of declaring 2020 to be Year Zero for the Commune. It meant that what looked like the end could also be seen as the beginning. That was the year the Commune decided to expand. More than a traditional revolutionary leader, Lonja felt he was the kind of poet in residence whose job was raising people's morale and animating those whose spirits had fallen. For example, he conceived the idea in reference to the pandemic that instead of staying at home, as the authorities directed, people should stay in the commune. He also riffed on Bolivar's quote about struggling against disobedient nature if it opposes us, saying instead that if disease and hunger oppose us, we will struggle against them. Beyond these symbolic gestures, there was real work and expansion of the commune's projects on various levels. Since the zone's community councils, the basis of communal construction had been on hold by governmental decree since 2014. Lonja's cadres invented the surrogate organizational format of panalitos and used it to expand popular power in the nearby barrios. Because schooling was closed, they developed the pluriversidad as a self-organized higher education project. The communards also strove to expand their work on productive fronts with new pig and fish farming projects in the barrio, and they sent brigades to some rural plots they had acquired in Miranda and Lara states, and began, in the face of numerous difficulties, especially their lack of knowledge of agriculture, to work there too. The truth is that from zero, there is nowhere else to go. The only thing you can do is keep on adding. Toward a brighter future. Jorge Quereguan is a main cadre of Alexis Vive. He came from one of the organization's satellite cells in the western city of Valencia to militate in Caracas' El Panal Commune during the blockade and pandemic years. On the morning of our third day visiting the commune, we encounter him in mud-stained clothes after having spent a night mucking out the pig pens under Lonja's office. Quereguan was exhausted, but in good spirits, having worked from dusk till dawn to replace the coffee hulls that function as litter in the deep bed pens. The state of his clothes has piqued our interest and makes us inquire into what was behind his having to pull an all-nighter. What seems to have happened is that some workers from the community had begun the chore of cleaning the pig pens, yet they signed off when the sun went down. However, true to the organization's ethics, Quereguan felt that he had to set a revolutionary example, and that meant staying till he had finished the job. Between sips of his morning coffee, Quereguan goes into some detail explaining this commune's progress on productive fronts, the steps they have taken in economic terms, and the fresh starting point that year zero, or 2020, which was the hardest year they lived through, represented for this committed group of communards. When Quereguan tells the story, I can perceive important similarities with the Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 62, when the first Chinese communes were built. Just as in that massive drive for accelerated socialist construction in China some 60 years ago. The methodology that the Alexis Vive collective promoted in Caracas was for people to throw themselves into productive projects, experiment, learn by doing, and even learn from errors. Of course, the historical evaluation of the Great Leap is highly contested, as it should be, given the widespread starvation that occurred at the same time. However, it must be kept in mind that despite the many errors and tragic loss of life, the Great Leap Forward represented a time when numerous people, especially in rural areas, broke out of the narrow routines that had characterized their lives and grew as individuals and revolutionaries. For many in China, it was their own year zero and, among other things, an important step in terms of personal development. Quereguan tells us how the urban pig farming project was born in this context of revolutionary experimentation. As part of a plan to feed the community, El Panal Commune had brought some pigs to Caracas to slaughter them. On discovering that one of the sows was pregnant, they let it give birth in Lonja's kitchen and began to raise the animals, experimenting with a variety of foods as alternatives to commercial feed. All their information came from trial and error or from watching videos and reading online. The same could be said for the fish farming project that also got going that year. They simply began throwing some tilapia minnows in an abandoned, unused pool. There was more watching of videos online and many failures. Later, the communards got some support from the government to build neat cylindrical tanks made of wire and plastic sheeting with freshwater feeds, which they now expect could yield up to 200 kilos of fresh fish every month. Quereguan tells us how, in all of this experimentation, the genius of the people and the will of the cadre are key. Trial by error and empirical discoveries are followed by technification of the production processes. Now El Panal's pig pen, which is based on Cuban deep litter methods that were widely used in urban areas during the special period, has more than 80 pigs, and they are developing plans for processing their own sausages and cold cuts. This way of working inevitably implies that the commune has a host of false starts and failures behind it. Yet it has constantly sought a way forward and has always relied on what it calls the creative powers of the people, who learn and gain confidence through experience. Overall, the commune's work since year zero has been a process of maturation for militants and community members who have been put to the test along the way and have consistently risen to the occasion. In that spirit, Quedaguan tells us, we cannot fail. We cannot let a few failures call into question the goal of the commune. That is because it is the hour of the commune. During the interview, an electric tricycle towing a cart heaped with plastic and cardboard waste pulls up. This is the commune's latest project, collecting plastic and electrical appliances and recycling them. Here again, the social and political is combined with the economic. The recycling project will generate revenues, but it is also aimed at giving jobs to youths who are at loose ends and might feel they have few options other than crime. Quedaguan explains that this is part of the commune's security plans, which are not based on repression like those of the state, but involve finding alternatives that respond to the roots of crime and encourage community participation. Indeed, the threesome who are unloading the plastic bottles appear happy to be doing something useful. Driving the electric tricycles, which they seem to approach as a novel kind of motorbike, works as a giant plus too. All of it points to how a situation where the police don't show their faces is much better for everyone. Without the presence of policing forces in this barrio, from which neighbors formerly needed to defend themselves, this community has developed an efficient internal security system that is about the neighbors themselves taking charge of what occurs and responding in thoughtful ways to incidents and problems as they arise. This flagship urban commune has scored victories in a number of areas, such as production, self-managed security, and education. To everyone's evident relief, the most oppressive features of the state apparatus are now either held at bay or made to serve the people, and there's a light at the end of the tunnel as far as the most basic economic issues are concerned. All the while, popular power is emerging from the doors that have been opened for it by a vanguard organization that shows commitment to the people and political clarity. The relaxed atmosphere in the zone speaks for this. The barrio fairly seethes with expressions of local empowerment, which also reveals itself in people's confident, calm, and cooperative attitudes, as well as in the harmonious coexistence that exists on the streets. For example, from the bench where we are chatting with Quedaguan, a COVID vaccine operation can be seen happening in a plaza nearby, while kids are repairing bikes and others are playing chess nearby. Overall, one senses that an entire weight has been lifted from this urban community. The weight of historical injustice, imperialist oppression, capitalist exploitation, and police repression. And with this weight lifted, the intrinsic, multiple, and varied powers of the people are emerging. It took the spark of a vanguard organization with seasoned militants to clear the path and point to the alternative that communal construction provides. However, today in this neighborhood, where both the tower blocks and state repression once cast such long shadows, the blue sky of dreams and hopes, symbolized in the baby blue shirts of Alexis Vive's militants, seems to be opening up for a large and growing community.